A Passage to India. Novel by E. M. Forster. Chapter 7. This Mr. Fielding had been caught by India late. He was over 40 when he entered that oddest portal, the Victoria terminus at Bombay, and, having bribed a European ticket inspector, took his luggage into the compartment of his first tropical train. The journey remained in his mind as significant. Of his two carriage companions, one was a youth, fresh to the East like himself, the other a seasoned Anglo-Indian of his own age. A gulf divided him from either. He had seen too many cities and men to be the first or to become the second. New impressions crowded on him, but they were not the orthodox new impressions. The past conditioned them, and so it was with his mistakes. To regard an Indian as if he were an Italian is not, for instance, a common error, nor perhaps a fatal one. And Fielding often attempted analogies between this peninsula and that other, smaller and more exquisitely shaped, that stretches into the classic waters of the Mediterranean. His career, though scholastic, was varied, and had included going to the bad and repenting thereafter. By now he was a hard-bitten, good-tempered, intelligent fellow on the verge of middle age, with a belief in education. He did not mind whom he taught. Public school boys, mental defectives and policemen, had all come his way, and he had no objection to adding Indians. Through the influence of friends, he was nominated principal of the little college at Chandrapore, liked it, and assumed he was a success. He did succeed with his pupils. But the gulf between himself and his countrymen, which he had noticed in the train, widened distressingly. He could not at first see what was wrong. He was not unpatriotic, he always got on with Englishmen in England. All his best friends were English, so why was it not the same out here? Outwardly of the large shaggy type, with sprawling limbs and blue eyes, he appeared to inspire confidence until he spoke. Then something in his manner puzzled people and failed to allay the distrust which his profession naturally inspired. There needs must be this evil of brains in India, but woe to him through whom they are increased. The feeling grew that Mr. Fielding was a disruptive force, and rightly, for ideas are fatal to caste, and he used ideas by that most potent method, interchange. Neither a missionary nor a student, he was happiest in the give and take of a private conversation. The world, he believed, is a globe of men who are trying to reach one another and can best do so by the help of goodwill plus culture and intelligence, a creed ill-suited to Chandrapore. But he had come out too late to lose it. He had no racial feeling, not because he was superior to his brother civilians, but because he had matured in a different atmosphere, where the herd instinct does not flourish. The remark that did him most harm at the club was a silly aside to the effect that the so-called white races are really pinko-grey. He only said this to be cheery. He did not realize that white has no more to do with the color than God save the king with the God, and that it is the height of impropriety to consider what it does connote. The pinko-grey male whom he addressed was subtly scandalized, his sense of insecurity was awoken, and he communicated it to the rest of the herd. Still, the men tolerated him for the sake of his good heart and strong body. It was their wives who decided that he was not a sahib really. They disliked him. He took no notice of them, and this, which would have passed without comment in feminist England, did him harm in a community where the male is expected to be lively and helpful. Mr. Fielding never advised one about dogs or horses, or dined, or paid his midday calls, or decorated trees for one's children at Christmas. And though he came to the club, it was only to get his tennis or billiards, and to go. This was true. He had discovered that it is possible to keep in with Indians and Englishmen, but that he who would also keep in with English women must drop the Indians. The two wouldn't combine. Useless to blame either party, useless to blame them for blaming one another. It just was so, and one had to choose. Most Englishmen preferred their own kinswomen, who, coming out in increasing numbers, made life on the home pattern yearly more possible. He had found it convenient and pleasant to associate with Indians, and he must pay the price. As a rule, no English woman entered the college except for official functions, and if he invited Mrs. Moore and Miss Quested to tea, it was because they were newcomers who would view everything with an equal if superficial eye, and would not turn on a special voice when speaking to his other guests. The college itself had been slapped down by the Public Works Department, but its grounds included an ancient garden and a garden house, and here he lived for much of the year. He was dressing after a bath when Dr. Aziz was announced. Lifting up his voice, he shouted from the bedroom, "Please make yourself at home." The remark was unpremeditated, like most of his actions, it was what he felt inclined to say. To Aziz it had a very definite meaning. "May I really, Mr. Fielding?" "It's very good of you," he called back. "I like unconventional behavior so extremely." His spirits flared up, he glanced round the living room. Some luxury in it, but no order, nothing to intimidate poor Indians. It was also a very beautiful room, opening into the garden through 3 high arches of wood. "The fact is I have long wanted to meet you," he continued. "I have heard so much about your warm heart from the Nawab Bahadur. But where is one to meet in a wretched hole like Chandrapore?" He came close up to the door. "When I was greener here, I'll tell you what. I used to wish you to fall ill so that we could meet that way." They laughed, and encouraged by his success he began to improvise. "I said to myself, how does Mr. Fielding look this morning? Perhaps pale. And the civil surgeon is pale too. He will not be able to attend upon him when the shivering commences. I should have been sent for instead. Then we would have had jolly talks, for you are a celebrated student of Persian poetry. You know me by sight, then?" Of course, of course. You know me?" "I know you very well by name. I have been here such a short time, and always in the bazaar. No wonder you have never seen me, and I wonder you know my name. I say, Mr. Fielding?" "Yes?" "Guess what I look like before you come out. That will be a kind of game." "You're 5 feet 9 inches high," said Fielding, surmising this much through the ground glass of the bedroom door. "Jolly good. What next? Have I not a venerable white beard?" "Blast. Anything wrong?" "I've stamped on my last collar stud." "Take mine, take mine." "Have you a spare one?" "Yes, yes, 1 minute." "Not if you're wearing it yourself." "No, no, one in my pocket." Stepping aside, so that his outline might vanish, he wrenched off his collar, and pulled out of his shirt the back stud, a gold stud, which was part of a set that his brother-in-law had brought him from Europe. "Here it is," he cried. "Come in with it if you don't mind the unconventionality." 1 minute again. Replacing his collar, he prayed that it would not spring up at the back during tea. Fielding's bearer, who was helping him to dress, opened the door for him. "Many thanks." They shook hands smiling. He began to look round, as he would have with any old friend. Fielding was not surprised at the rapidity of their intimacy. With so emotional a people it was apt to come at once or never, and he and Aziz, having heard only good of each other, could afford to dispense with preliminaries. "But I always thought that Englishmen kept their rooms so tidy. It seems that this is not so. I need not be so ashamed." He sat down gaily on the bed, then, forgetting himself entirely, drew up his legs and folded them under him. "Everything ranged coldly on shelves was what I thought. I say, Mr. Fielding, is the stud going to go in?" "I hey ma doots." "What's that last sentence, please? Will you teach me some new words and so improve my English?" Fielding doubted whether everything ranged coldly on shelves could be improved. He was often struck with the liveliness with which the younger generation handled a foreign tongue. They altered the idiom, but they could say whatever they wanted to say quickly. There were none of the babuisms ascribed to them up at the club. But then the club moved slowly. It still declared that few Mohammedans and no Hindus would eat at an Englishman's table, and that all Indian ladies were in impenetrable purdah. Individually it knew better, as a club it declined to change. "Let me put in your stud. I see, the shirt back's hole is rather small and to rip it wider a pity. Why in hell does one wear collars at all?" grumbled Fielding as he bent his neck. "We wear them to pass the police." "What's that?" "If I'm biking an English dress, starch collar, hat with ditch, they take no notice. When I wear a fez, they cry, "Your lamp's out." Lord Curzon did not consider this when he urged natives of India to retain their picturesque costumes. Hooray! Studs gone in. Sometimes I shut my eyes and dream I have splendid clothes again and am riding into battle behind a lomgia. Mr. Fielding, must not India have been beautiful then, with the Mughal Empire at its height and a lomgia reigning at Delhi upon the peacock throne? 2 ladies are coming to tea to meet you, I think you know them. Meet me? I know no ladies. Not Mrs. Moore and Miss Quested? Oh yes, I remember. The romance at the mosque had sunk out of his consciousness as soon as it was over. An excessively aged lady, but will you please repeat the name of her companion? Miss Quested. Just as you wish. He was disappointed that other guests were coming, for he preferred to be alone with his new friend. You can talk to Miss Quested about the peacock throne if you like, she's artistic, they say. Is she a post-impressionist? Post-impressionism, indeed. Come along to tea. This world is getting too much for me altogether. Aziz was offended. The remark suggested that he, an obscure Indian, had no right to have heard of post-impressionism, a privilege reserved for the ruling race, that. He said stiffly, I do not consider Mrs. Moore my friend, I only met her accidentally in my mosque, and was adding a single meeting is too short to make a friend, but before he could finish the sentence the stiffness vanished from it, because he felt Fielding's fundamental goodwill. His own went out to it, and grappled beneath the shifting tides of emotion which can alone bear the voyager to an anchorage but may also carry him across it onto the rocks. He was safe really. As safe as the shore dweller who can only understand stability and supposes that every ship must be wrecked, and he had sensations the shore dweller cannot know. Indeed, he was sensitive rather than responsive. In every remark he found a meaning. But not always the true meaning, and his life though vivid was largely a dream. Fielding, for instance, had not meant that Indians are obscure, but that post-impressionism is. A gulf divided his remark from Mrs. Turton's why, they speak English. But to Aziz the two sounded alike. Fielding saw that something had gone wrong, and equally that it had come right, but he didn't fidget, being an optimist where personal relations were concerned, and their talk rattled on as before. Besides the ladies I am expecting one of my assistants, Narayan Godbole. Oh ho, the Dakhani Brahmin. He wants the past back too, but not precisely a lomgia. I should think not. Do you know what Dakhani Brahmins say? That England conquered India from them, mind, and not from the Mughals. Is not that like their cheek? They have even bribed it to appear in textbooks, for they are so subtle and immensely rich. Professor Godbole must be quite unlike all other Dakhani Brahmins from all I can hear say. A most sincere chap. Why don't you fellows run a club in Chandrapore, Aziz? Perhaps, some day. Just now I see Mrs. Moore and, what's her name, coming. How fortunate that it was an unconventional party, where formalities are ruled out. On this basis Aziz found the English ladies easy to talk to, he treated them like men. Beauty would have troubled him, for it entails rules of its own. But Mrs. Moore was so old and Miss Quested so plain that he was spared this anxiety. Adela's angular body and the freckles on her face were terrible defects in his eyes, and he wondered how God could have been so unkind to any female form. His attitude towards her remained entirely straightforward in consequence. I want to ask you something, Dr. Aziz, she began. I heard from Mrs. Moore how helpful you were to her in the mosque. And how interesting. She learned more about India in those few minutes' talk with you than in the 3 weeks since we landed. Oh, please do not mention a little thing like that. Is there anything else I may tell you about my country? I want you to explain a disappointment we had this morning. It must be some point of Indian etiquette. There honestly is none, he replied. We are by nature a most informal people. I am afraid we must have made some blunder and given offence, said Mrs. Moore. That is even more impossible. But may I know the facts? An Indian lady and gentleman were to send their carriage for us this morning at 9. It has never come. We waited and waited and waited, we can't think what happened. Some misunderstanding, said Fielding, seeing at once that it was the type of incident that had better not be cleared up. Oh no, it wasn't that, Miss Quested persisted. They even gave up going to Calcutta to entertain us. We must have made some stupid blunder, we both feel sure. I wouldn't worry about that. Exactly what Mr. Heaslop tells me, she retorted, reddening a little. If one doesn't worry, how's one to understand? The host was inclined to change the subject, but Aziz took it up warmly, and on learning fragments of the delinquent's name pronounced that they were Hindus. Slack Hindus, they have no idea of society. I know them very well because of a doctor at the hospital. Such a slack, unpunctual fellow. It is as well you did not go to their house, for it would give you a wrong idea of India. Nothing sanitary. I think for my own part they grew ashamed of their house and that is why they did not send. That's a notion, said the other man. I do so hate mysteries, Adela announced. We English do. I dislike them not because I'm English, but from my own personal point of view, she corrected. I like mysteries but I rather dislike muddles, said Mrs. Moore. A mystery is a muddle. Oh, do you think so, Mr. Fielding? A mystery is only a high-sounding term for a muddle. No advantage in stirring it up, in either case. Aziz and I know well that India's a muddle. India's, oh, what an alarming idea. There'll be no muddle when you come to see me, said Aziz, rather out of his depth. Mrs. Moore and everyone, I invite you all, oh, please. The old lady accepted, she still thought the young doctor excessively nice, moreover, a new feeling, half languor, half excitement, bade her turn down any fresh path. Miss Quested accepted out of adventure. She also liked Aziz, and believed that when she knew him better he would unlock his country for her. His invitation gratified her, and she asked him for his address. Aziz thought of his bungalow with horror. It was a detestable shanty near a low bazaar. There was practically only one room in it, and that infested with small black flies. Oh, but we will talk of something else now, he exclaimed. I wish I lived here. See this beautiful room. Let us admire it together for a little. See those curves at the bottom of the arches. What delicacy! It is the architecture of question and answer. Mrs. Moore, you are in India, I am not joking. The room inspired him. It was an audience hall built in the 18th century for some high official, and though it would had reminded Fielding of the Loggia Delancey at Florence. Little rooms, now Europeanized, clung to it on either side, but the central hall was unpapered and unglassed, and the air of the garden poured in freely. One sat in public, on exhibition, as it were, in full view of the gardeners who were screaming at the birds and of the man who rented the tank for the cultivation of water chestnut. Fielding let the mango trees too, there was no knowing who might not come in, and his servants sat on his steps night and day to discourage thieves. Beautiful certainly. And the Englishman had not spoilt it, whereas Aziz in an Occidental moment would have hung more Goodmans on the walls. Yet there was no doubt to whom the room really belonged. I am doing justice here. A poor widow who has been robbed comes along and I give her 50 rupees, to another 100, and so on and so on. I should like that. Mrs. Moore smiled, thinking of the modern method as exemplified in her son. Rupees don't last forever, I'm afraid, she said. Mine would. God would give me more when he saw I gave. Always be giving, like the Nawab Bahadur. My father was the same, that is why he died poor. And pointing about the room he peopled it with clerks and officials, all benevolent because they lived long ago. So we would sit giving forever, on a carpet instead of chairs, that is the chief change between now and then, but I think we would never punish anyone. The ladies agreed. Poor criminal, give him another chance. It only makes a man worse to go to prison and be corrupted. His face grew very tender, the tenderness of one incapable of administration, and unable to grasp that if the poor criminal is let off he will again rob the poor widow. He was tender to everyone except a few family enemies whom he did not consider human, on these he desired revenge. He was even tender to the English. He knew at the bottom of his heart that they could not help being so cold and odd and circulating like an ice stream through his land. "We punish no one, he repeated. "And in the evening we will give a great banquet with a nutch, and lovely girls shall shine on every side of the tank with fireworks in their hands, and all shall be feasting and happiness until the next day, when there shall be justice as before, 50 rupees, 100, 1,000, till peace comes." Ah, why didn't we live in that time? But are you admiring Mr. Fielding's house? Do look how the pillars are painted blue. And the verandas, pavilions, what do you call them, that are above us inside are blue also. Look at the carving on the pavilions. Think of the hours it took. Their little roofs are curved to imitate bamboo. So pretty, and the bamboos waving by the tank outside. Mrs. Moore. Mrs. Moore. "Well?" she said, laughing. "You remember the water by our mosque? It comes down and fills this tank, a skillful arrangement of the emperors. They stopped here going down into Bengal. They loved water. Wherever they went they created fountains, gardens, hammams. I was telling Mr. Fielding I would give anything to serve them. He was wrong about the water, which no emperor, however skillful, can cause to gravitate uphill. A depression of some depth together with the whole of Chandrapore lay between the mosque and Fielding's house. Ronnie would have pulled him up, Turton would have wanted to pull him up, but restrained himself. Fielding did not even want to pull him up. He had dulled his craving for verbal truth and cared chiefly for truth of mood. As for Miss Quested, she accepted everything Aziz said as true verbally. In her ignorance, she regarded him as India, and never surmised that his outlook was limited and his method inaccurate, and that no one is India. He was now much excited, chattering away hard, and even saying damn when he got mixed up in his sentences. He told them of his profession, and of the operations he had witnessed and performed. And he went into details that scared Mrs. Moore, though Miss Quested mistook them for proofs of his broad-mindedness. She had heard such talk at home in advanced academic circles, deliberately free. She supposed him to be emancipated as well as reliable, and placed him on a pinnacle which he could not retain. He was high enough for the moment, to be sure, but not on any pinnacle. Wings bore him up, and flagging would deposit him. The arrival of Professor Godbole quieted him somewhat, but it remained his afternoon. The Brahmin, polite and enigmatic, did not impede his eloquence, and even applauded it. He took his tea at a little distance from the outcasts, from a low table placed slightly behind him, to which he stretched back, and as it were encountered food by accident, all feigned indifference to Professor Godbole's tea. He was elderly and wizen with a grey moustache and grey-blue eyes, and his complexion was as fair as a European's. He wore a turban that looked like pale purple macaroni, coat, waistcoat, dirty, socks with clocks. The clocks matched the turban, and his whole appearance suggested harmony, as if he had reconciled the products of East and West, mental as well as physical, and could never be discomposed. The ladies were interested in him, and hoped that he would supplement Dr. Aziz by saying something about religion. But he only ate and ate, smiling, never letting his eyes catch sight of his hand. Leaving the Mughal emperors, Aziz turned to topics that could distress no one. He described the ripening of the mangoes, and how in his boyhood he used to run out in the rains to a big mango grove belonging to an uncle and gorge there. Then back with water streaming over you and perhaps rather a pain inside. But I did not mind. All my friends were paining with me. We have a proverb in Urdu, what does unhappiness matter when we are all unhappy together? Which comes in conveniently after mangoes. Miss Quested, do wait for mangoes. Why not settle all together in India? I'm afraid I can't do that, said Adela. She made the remark without thinking what it meant. To her, as to the three men, it seemed in key with the rest of the conversation, and not for several minutes, indeed, not for half an hour, did she realize that it was an important remark, and ought to have been made in the first place to Ronnie. Visitors like you are too rare. They are indeed, said Professor Godbole. Such affability is seldom seen. But what can we offer to detain them? Mangoes, mangoes. They laughed. Even mangoes can be got in England now, put in Fielding. They ship them in ice-cold rooms. You can make India in England apparently, just as you can make England in India. Frightfully expensive in both cases, said the girl. I suppose so. And nasty. But the host wouldn't allow the conversation to take this heavy turn. He turned to the old lady, who looked flustered and put out, he could not imagine why, and asked about her own plans. She replied that she should like to see over the college. Everyone immediately rose, with the exception of Professor Goadbillet, who was finishing a banana. Don't you come too, Adela, you dislike institutions. Yes, that is so, said Miss Quested, and sat down again. Aziz hesitated. His audience was splitting up. The more familiar half was going, but the more attentive remained. Reflecting that it was an unconventional afternoon, he stopped. Talk went on as before. Could one offer the visitors unripe mangoes in a fool? I speak now as a doctor, no. Then the old man said, but I will send you up a few healthy sweets. I will give myself that pleasure. Miss Quested, Professor Goadbillet's sweets are delicious, said Aziz sadly, for he wanted to send sweets too and had no wife to cook them. They will give you a real Indian treat. Ah, in my poor position I can give you nothing. I don't know why you say that, when you have so kindly asked us to your house. He thought again of his bungalow with horror. Good heavens, the stupid girl had taken him at his word. What was he to do? Yes, all that is settled, he cried. I invite you all to see me in the Marabar Caves. I shall be delighted. Oh, that is a most magnificent entertainment compared to my poor sweets. But has not Miss Quested visited our caves already? No. I've not even heard of them. Not heard of them? Both cried. The Marabar Caves in the Marabar Hills? We hear nothing interesting up at the club. Only tennis and ridiculous gossip. The old man was silent, perhaps feeling that it was unseemly of her to criticize her ace, perhaps fearing that if he agreed she would report him for disloyalty. But the young man uttered a rapid I know. Then tell me everything you will, or I shall never understand India. Are they the hills I sometimes see in the evening? What are these caves? Aziz undertook to explain, but it presently appeared that he had never visited the caves himself, had always been meaning to go, but work or private business had prevented him, and they were so far. Professor Goadbillet chaffed him pleasantly. My dear young sir, the pot and the kettle. Have you ever heard of that useful proverb? Are they large caves? She asked. No, not large. Do describe them, Professor Goadbillet. It will be a great honor. He drew up his chair and an expression of tension came over his face. Taking the cigarette box, she offered to him and to Aziz, and lit up herself. After an impressive pause he said, there is an entrance in the rock which you enter, and through the entrance is the cave. Something like the caves at Elephanta? Oh no, not at all. At Elephanta there are sculptures of Shiva and Parvati. There are no sculptures at Marabar. They are immensely holy, no doubt, said Aziz, to help on the narrative. Oh no, oh no. Still, they are ornamented in some way. Oh no. Well, why are they so famous? We all talk of the famous Marabar Caves. Perhaps that is our empty brag. No, I should not quite say that. Describe them to this lady, then. It will be a great pleasure. He forewent the pleasure, and Aziz realized that he was keeping back something about the caves. He realized because he often suffered from similar inhibitions himself. Sometimes, to the exasperation of Major Calendar, he would pass over the one relevant fact in a position, to dwell on the 100 irrelevant. The Major accused him of disingenuousness, and was roughly right, but only roughly. It was rather that a power he couldn't control capriciously silenced his mind. Goadbillet had been silenced now. No doubt not willingly, he was concealing something. Handled subtly, he might regain control and announce that the Marabar Caves were full of stalactites, perhaps. Aziz led up to this, but they weren't. The dialogue remained light and friendly, and Adela had no conception of its underdrift. She did not know that the comparatively simple mind of the Mohammedan was encountering ancient night. Aziz played a thrilling game. He was handling a human toy that refused to work, he knew that much. If it worked, neither he nor Professor Godbole would be the least advantaged. But the attempt enthralled him and was akin to abstract thought. On he chattered, defeated at every move by an opponent who would not even admit that a move had been made, and further than ever from discovering what, if anything, was extraordinary about the Marabar Caves. Into this Ronnie dropped. With an annoyance he took no trouble to conceal, he called from the garden, "What's happened to Fielding? Where's my mother?" "Good evening," she replied coolly. "I want you and mother at once. There's to be polo." "I thought there was to be no polo." "Everything's altered. Some soldier men have come in. Come along and I'll tell you about it." "Your mother will return shortly, sir," said Professor Godbole, who had risen with deference. "There is but little to see at our poor college." Ronnie took no notice, but continued to address his remarks to Adela. He had hurried away from his work to take her to see the polo, because he thought it would give her pleasure. He did not mean to be rude to the two men, but the only link he could be conscious of with an Indian was the official, and neither happened to be his subordinate. As private individuals he forgot them. Unfortunately Aziz was in no mood to be forgotten. He would not give up the secure and intimate note of the last hour. He had not risen with Godbole, and now, offensively friendly, called from his seat. "Come along up and join us, Mr. Heaslop, sit down till your mother turns up." Ronnie replied by ordering one of Fielding's servants to fetch his master at once. "He may not understand that." "Allow me," Aziz repeated the order idiomatically. Ronnie was tempted to retort, he knew the type, he knew all the types, and this was the spoilt westernized. But he was a servant of the government, it was his job to avoid incidents, so he said nothing, and ignored the provocation that Aziz continued to offer. Aziz was provocative. Everything he said had an impertinent flavor or jarred. His wings were failing, but he refused to fall without a struggle. He did not mean to be impertinent to Mr. Heaslop, who had never done him harm, but here was an Anglo-Indian who must become a man before comfort could be regained. He did not mean to be greasily confidential to Miss Quested, only to enlist her support, nor to be loud and jolly towards Professor Godbole. A strange quartet, he fluttering to the ground, she puzzled by the sudden ugliness, Ronnie fuming. The Brahmin observing all three, but with downcast eyes and hands folded, as if nothing was noticeable. A scene from a play, thought Fielding, who now saw them from the distance across the garden grouped among the blue pillars of his beautiful hall. "Don't trouble to come, mother," Ronnie called, "we're just starting." Then he hurried to Fielding, drew him aside and said with pseudo-heartiness, "I say, old man, do excuse me, but I think perhaps you oughtn't to have left Miss Quested alone." "I'm sorry, what's up?" replied Fielding, also trying to be genial. "Well, I'm the sun-dried bureaucrat, no doubt, still, I don't like to see an English girl left smoking with two Indians." She stopped, as she smokes, by her own wish, old man. "Yes, that's all right in England. I really can't see the harm." "If you can't see, you can't see. Can't you see that fellow's a bounder?" Aziz, flamboyant, was patronizing Mrs. Moore. "He isn't a bounder," protested Fielding. "His nerves are on edge, that's all." "What should have upset his precious nerves?" "I don't know. He was all right when I left." "Well, it's nothing I've said," said Ronnie reassuringly. "I never even spoke to him." "Oh well, come along now, and take your ladies away, the catastrophe over." "Fielding, don't think I'm taking it badly, or anything of that sort. I suppose you won't come on to the polo with us? We should all be delighted." "I'm afraid I can't, thanks all the same. I'm awfully sorry you feel I've been remiss. I didn't mean to be." So the leave-taking began. Everyone was cross or wretched. It was as if irritation exuded from the very soil. Could one have been so petty on a Scotch moor or an Italian Alp? Fielding wondered afterwards. There seemed no reserve of tranquility to draw upon in India. Either none, or else tranquility swallowed up everything, as it appeared to do for Professor Goadbillet. Here was Aziz all shoddy and odious, Mrs. Moore and Miss Quested both silly, and he himself and he Slop both decorous on the surface, but detestable really, and detesting each other. "Goodbye, Mr. Fielding, and thank you so much. What lovely college buildings." "Goodbye, Mrs. Moore." "Goodbye, Mr. Fielding. Such an interesting afternoon." "Goodbye, Miss Quested." "Goodbye, Dr. Aziz." "Goodbye, Mrs. Moore." "Goodbye, Dr. Aziz." "Goodbye, Miss Quested." He pumped her hand up and down to show that he felt at ease. "You'll jolly well not forget those caves, won't you? I'll fix the whole show up in a jiffy." "Thank you." Inspired by the devil to a final effort, he added, "What a shame you leave India so soon. Oh, do reconsider your decision, do stay." "Goodbye, Professor Goadbillet," she continued, suddenly agitated. "It's a shame we never heard you sing." "I may sing now," he replied, and did. His thin voice rose, and gave out one sound after another. At times there seemed rhythm, at times there was the illusion of a Western melody. But the ear, baffled repeatedly, soon lost any clue, and wandered in a maze of noises, none harsh or unpleasant, none intelligible. It was the song of an unknown bird. Only the servants understood it. They began to whisper to one another. The man who was gathering water chestnut came naked out of the tank, his lips parted with delight, disclosing his scarlet tongue. The sounds continued and ceased after a few moments as casually as they had begun, apparently half through a bar, and upon the subdominant. "Thanks so much, what was that?" asked Fielding. "I will explain in detail. It was a religious song. I placed myself in the position of a milkmaiden. I say to Sri Krishna, come. Come to me only. The god refuses to come. I grow humble and say, do not come to me only. Multiply yourself into 100 Krishnas, and let one go to each of my 100 companions, but one. O Lord of the universe, come to me. He refuses to come. This is repeated several times. The song is composed in a raga appropriate to the present hour, which is the evening. But he comes in some other song, I hope, said Mrs. Moore gently. Oh no, he refuses to come, repeated Goadbillet, perhaps not understanding her question. I say to him, come, 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 come. He neglects to come. Ronnie's steps had died away, and there was a moment of absolute silence. No ripple disturbed the water, no leaf stirred. End of the chapter. Now, let's listen to Chapter 8. Although Miss Quested had known Ronnie well in England, she felt well advised to visit him before deciding to be his wife. India had developed sides of his character that she had never admired. His self-complacency, his censoriousness, his lack of subtlety, all grew vivid beneath a tropic sky. He seemed more indifferent than of old to what was passing in the minds of his fellows, more certain that he was right about them or that if he was wrong it didn't matter. When proved wrong, he was particularly exasperating. He always managed to suggest that she needn't have bothered to prove it. The point she made was never the relevant point, her arguments conclusive but barren. She was reminded that he had expert knowledge and she none, and that experience would not help her because she could not interpret it. A public school, London University, a year at a crammer's, a particular sequence of posts in a particular province. A fall from a horse and a touch of fever were presented to her as the only training by which Indians and all who reside in their country can be understood, the only training she could comprehend, that is to say. For of course above Ronnie there stretched the higher realms of knowledge, inhabited by calendars and tertons, who had been not 1 year in the country but 20 and whose instincts were superhuman. For himself he made no extravagant claims, she wished he would. It was the qualified bray of the callow official, the I am not perfect, but, that got on her nerves. How gross he had been at Mr. Fielding's, spoiling the talk and walking off in the middle of the haunting song. As he drove them away in the tum-tum, her irritation became unbearable. And she did not realize that much of it was directed against herself. She longed for an opportunity to fly out at him, and since he felt cross too, and they were both in India, an opportunity soon occurred. They had scarcely left the college grounds before she heard him say to his mother, who was with him on the front seat, "What was that about caves?" And she promptly opened fire. "Mrs. Moore, your delightful doctor has decided on a picnic, instead of a party in his house. We are to meet him out there, you, myself, Mr. Fielding, Professor Godbillay, exactly the same party." "Out where?" asked Ronnie. "The Marabar Caves." "Well, I'm blessed," he murmured after a pause. "Did he descend to any details?" "He did not. If you had spoken to him, we could have arranged them." He shook his head laughing. "Have I said anything funny? I was only thinking how the worthy doctor's collar climbed up his neck." "I thought you were discussing the caves." "So I am." Aziz was exquisitely dressed, from tie-pin to spats, but he had forgotten his back collar stud, and there you have the Indian all over, inattention to detail, the fundamental slackness that reveals the race. Similarly, to meet in the caves as if they were the clock at Charing Cross, when they're miles from a station and each other. "Have you been to them?" "No, but I know all about them, naturally." "Oh, naturally. Are you two pledged to this expedition, Mother?" "Mother is pledged to nothing," said Mrs. Moore, rather unexpectedly. "Certainly not to this polo. Will you drive up to the bungalow first, and drop me there, please? I prefer to rest." "Drop me too," said Adela. "I don't want to watch polo either, I'm sure." "Simpler to drop the polo," said Ronnie. Tired and disappointed, he quite lost self-control, and added in a loud lecturing voice, "I won't have you messing about with Indians anymore. If you want to go to the Marabar Caves, you'll go under British auspices." "I've never heard of these caves, I don't know what or where they are," said Mrs. Moore, "but I really can't have." She tapped the cushion beside her, so much quarrelling and tiresomeness. The young people were ashamed. They dropped her at the bungalow and drove on together to the polo, feeling it was the least they could do. Their crackling bad humor left them. But the heaviness of their spirit remained. Thunderstorms seldom clear the air. Miss Quested was thinking over her own behavior, and didn't like it at all. Instead of weighing Ronnie and herself, and coming to a reasoned conclusion about marriage, she had incidentally, in the course of a talk about mangoes, remarked to mixed company that she didn't mean to stop in India. Which meant that she wouldn't marry Ronnie, but what a way to announce it, what a way for a civilized girl to behave. She owed him an explanation, but unfortunately there was nothing to explain. The thorough talk so dear to her principles and temperament had been postponed until too late. There seemed no point in being disagreeable to him and formulating her complaints against his character at this hour of the day, which was the evening. The polo took place on the Maidan near the entrance of Chandrapore city. The sun was already declining and each of the trees held a premonition of night. They walked away from the governing group to a distant seat, and there, feeling that it was his due and her own, she forced out of herself the undigested remark, "We must have a thorough talk, Ronnie, I'm afraid." "My temper's rotten, I must apologize," was his reply. "I didn't mean to order you and Mother about, but of course the way those Bengalis let you down this morning annoyed me, and I don't want that sort of thing to keep happening. It's nothing to do with them that I know, but Aziz would make some similar muddle over the caves. He meant nothing by the invitation, I could tell by his voice, it's just their way of being pleasant. It's something very different, nothing to do with caves, that I wanted to talk over with you." She gazed at the colorless grass. "I've finally decided we are not going to be married, my dear boy." The news hurt Ronnie very much. He had heard Aziz announce that she would not return to the country, but had paid no attention to the remark, for he never dreamt that an Indian could be a channel of communication between two English people. He controlled himself and said gently, "You never said we should marry, my dear girl, you never bound either yourself or me, don't let this upset you." She felt ashamed. How decent he was. He might force his opinions down her throat, but did not press her to an engagement, because he believed, like herself, in the sanctity of personal relationships. It was this that had drawn them together at their first meeting, which had occurred among the grand scenery of the English lakes. Her ordeal was over, but she felt it should have been more painful and longer. Adela will not marry Ronnie. It seemed slipping away like a dream. She said, "But let us discuss things, it's all so frightfully important, we mustn't make false steps. I want next to hear your point of view about me, it might help us both." His manner was unhappy and reserved. "I don't much believe in this discussing, besides, I'm so dead with all this extra work Moharam's bringing, if you'll excuse me. I only want everything to be absolutely clear between us, and to answer any questions you care to put to me on my conduct." "But I haven't got any questions. You've acted within your rights, you were quite right to come out and have a look at me doing my work, it was an excellent plan, and anyhow it's no use talking further. We should only get up steam." He felt angry and bruised, he was too proud to tempt her back, but he did not consider that she had behaved badly, because where his compatriots were concerned he had a generous mind. "I suppose that there is nothing else. It's unpardonable of me to have given you and your mother all this bother," said Miss Quested heavily, and frowned up at the tree beneath which they were sitting. A little green bird was observing her, so brilliant and neat that it might have hopped straight out of a shop. On catching her eye it closed its own, gave a small skip and prepared to go to bed. "Some Indian wild bird." "Yes, nothing else," she repeated, feeling that a profound and passionate speech ought to have been delivered by one or both of them. "We've been awfully British over it, but I suppose that's all right. As we are British, I suppose it is. Anyhow we've not quarrelled, Ronnie." "Oh, that would have been too absurd. Why should we quarrel? I think we shall keep friends." "I know we shall." "Quite so." As soon as they had exchanged this admission, a wave of relief passed through them both, and then transformed itself into a wave of tenderness, and passed back. They were softened by their own honesty, and began to feel lonely and unwise. Experiences, not character, divided them. They were not dissimilar, as humans go. Indeed, when compared with the people who stood nearest to them in point of space they became practically identical. The Bhil who was holding an officer's polo pony, the Eurasian who drove the Nawab Bahadur's car, the Nawab Bahadur himself, the Nawab Bahadur's debauched grandson, none would have examined a difficulty so frankly and coolly. The mere fact of examination caused it to diminish. Of course they were friends, and forever. "Do you know what the name of that green bird up above us is?" she asked, putting her shoulder rather nearer to his. "Bee-eater." "Oh no, Ronnie, it has red bars on its wings." "Parrot," he hazarded. "Good gracious no." The bird in question dived into the dome of the tree. It was of no importance, yet they would have liked to identify it, it would somehow have solaced their hearts. But nothing in India is identifiable, the mere asking of a question causes it to disappear or to merge in something else. "McBride has an illustrated bird book," he said dejectedly. "I'm no good at all at birds, in fact I'm useless at any information outside my own job. It's a great pity. So am I. I'm useless at everything." "What do I hear?" shouted the Nawab Bahadur at the top of his voice, causing both of them to start. "What most improbable statement have I heard? An English lady useless? No, 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 no," he laughed genially, sure, within limits, of his welcome. "Hello, Nawab Bahadur. Been watching the polo again?" said Ronnie tepidly. "I have, Sahib, I have." "How do you do?" said Adela, likewise pulling herself together. She held out her hand. The old gentleman judged from so wanton a gesture that she was new to his country, but he paid little heed. Women who exposed their face became by that one act so mysterious to him that he took them at the valuation of their menfolk rather than at his own. Perhaps they were not immoral, and anyhow they were not his affair. On seeing the city magistrate alone with the maiden at twilight, he had borne down on them with hospitable intent. He had a new little car, and wished to place it at their disposal. The city magistrate would decide whether the offer was acceptable. Ronnie was by this time rather ashamed of his curtness to Aziz and Godbillay, and here was an opportunity of showing that he could treat Indians with consideration when they deserved it. So he said to Adela, with the same sad friendliness that he had employed when discussing the bird, "Would half an hour's spin entertain you at all? Oughtn't we to get back to the bungalow?" "Why?" He gazed at her. "I think perhaps I ought to see your mother and discuss future plans." "That's as you like, but there's no hurry, is there?" "Let me take you to the bungalow, and first the little spin," cried the old man, and hastened to the car. "He may show you some aspect of the country I can't, and he's a real loyalist. I thought you might care for a bit of a change." Determined to give him no more trouble, she agreed, but her desire to see India had suddenly decreased. There had been a factitious element in it. How should they seat themselves in the car? The elegant grandson had to be left behind. The Nawab Bahadur got up in front, for he had no intention of neighbouring an English girl. "Despite my advanced years, I am learning to drive," he said. "Man can learn everything if he will but try." And foreseeing a further difficulty, he added, "I do not do the actual steering. I sit and ask my chauffeur questions, and thus learn the reason for everything that is done before I do it myself." By this method serious and I may say ludicrous accidents, such as befell one of my compatriots during that delightful reception at the English Club, are avoided. Our good Panalal. I hope, Sahib, that great damage was not done to your flowers. Let us have our little spin down the Gangavati road. Half 1 league onwards. He fell asleep. Ronnie instructed the chauffeur to take the Marabar road rather than the Gangavati, since the latter was under repair, and settled himself down beside the lady he had lost. The car made a burring noise and rushed along a chaussee that ran upon an embankment above melancholy fields. Trees of a poor quality bordered the road. Indeed, the whole scene was inferior, and suggested that the countryside was too vast to admit of excellence. In vain did each item in it call out, "Come, come." There was not enough God to go round. The two young people conversed feebly and felt unimportant. When the darkness began, it seemed to well out of the meagre vegetation, entirely covering the fields each side of them before it brimmed over the road. Ronnie's face grew dim, an event that always increased her esteem for his character. Her hand touched his, owing to a jolt, and one of the thrills so frequent in the animal kingdom passed between them, and announced that all their difficulties were only a lover's quarrel. Each was too proud to increase the pressure, but neither withdrew it, and a spurious unity descended on them as local and temporary as the gleam that inhabits a firefly. It would vanish in a moment, perhaps to reappear, but the darkness is alone durable. And the night that encircled them, absolute as it seemed, was itself only a spurious unity, being modified by the gleams of day that leaked up round the edges of the earth, and by the stars. They gripped, bump, jump, a swerve, two wheels lifted in the air, brakes on, bump with tree at edge of embankment, stand still. An accident. A slight one. Nobody hurt. The Nawab Bahadur awoke. He cried out in Arabic, and violently tugged his beard. "What's the damage?" inquired Ronnie, after the moment's pause that he permitted himself before taking charge of a situation. The Eurasian, inclined to be flustered, rallied to the sound of his voice, and, every inch an Englishman, replied, "You give me 5 minutes' time, I'll take you any damn anywhere." "Frightened, Adela?" He released her hand. "Not a bit. I consider not to be frightened the height of folly," cried the Nawab Bahadur quite rudely. "Well, it's all over now, tears are useless," said Ronnie, dismounting. "We had some luck butting that tree." "All over, oh yes, the danger is past, let us smoke cigarettes, let us do anything we please." Oh yes, enjoy ourselves, oh my merciful God." His words died into Arabic again. "Wasn't the bridge? We skidded." "We didn't skid," said Adela, who had seen the cause of the accident, and thought everyone must have seen it too. "We ran into an animal." A loud cry broke from the old man. His terror was disproportionate and ridiculous. "An animal? A large animal rushed up out of the dark on the right and hit us." "By Jove, she's right," Ronnie exclaimed. "The paint's gone." "By Jove, sir, your lady is right," echoed the Eurasian. Just by the hinges of the door was a dent, and the door opened with difficulty. "Of course I'm right. I saw its hairy back quite plainly." "I say, Adela, what was it?" "I don't know the animals any better than the birds here. Too big for a goat." "Exactly, too big for a goat," said the old man. Ronnie said, "Let's go into this, let's look for its tracks." "Exactly, you wish to borrow this electric torch." The English people walked a few steps back into the darkness, united and happy. Thanks to their youth and upbringing, they were not upset by the accident. They traced back the writhing of the tires to the source of their disturbance. It was just after the exit from a bridge. The animal had probably come up out of the nullah. Steady and smooth ran the marks of the car, ribbons neatly nicked with lozenges, then all went mad. Certainly some external force had impinged. But the road had been used by too many objects for any one track to be legible, and the torch created such highlights and black shadows that they could not interpret what it revealed. Moreover, Adela in her excitement knelt and swept her skirts about, until it was she if anyone who appeared to have attacked the car. The incident was a great relief to them both. They forgot their abortive personal relationship, and felt adventurous as they muddled about in the dust. "I believe it was a buffalo," she called to their host, who had not accompanied them. "Exactly. Unless it was a hyena." Ronnie approved this last conjecture. Hyenas prowl in nullahs and headlights dazzled them. "Excellent, a hyena," said the Indian with an angry irony and a gesture at the night. "Mr. Harris. Half a moment. Give me 10 minutes time. Sahib says hyena. Don't worry Mr. Harris. He saved us from a nasty smash. Harris, well done. A smash, Sahib, that would not have taken place had he obeyed and taken us Gangavati side, instead of Marabar. My fault that. I told him to come this way because the road's better. Mr. Leslie has made it pucker right up to the hills. Ah, now I begin to understand. Seeming to pull himself together, he apologized slowly and elaborately for the accident. Ronnie murmured, "Not at all, but apologies were his due, and should have started sooner, because English people are so calm at a crisis, it is not to be assumed that they are unimportant." The Nawab Bahadur had not come out very well. At that moment a large car approached from the opposite direction. Ronnie advanced a few steps down the road, and with authority in his voice and gesture stopped it. It bore the inscription Mudcall State across its bonnet. All friskiness and friendliness, Miss Derrick sat inside. "Mr. Heaslop," Miss quested, "what are you holding up an innocent female for?" "We've had a breakdown." "But how putrid." "We ran into a hyena." "How absolutely rotten." "Can you give us a lift?" "Yes, indeed." "Take me too," said the Nawab Bahadur. "Hey, what about me?" cried Mr. Harris. "Now what's all this?" "I'm not an omnibus," said Miss Derrick with decision. "I've a harmonium and 2 dogs in here with me as it is. I'll take 3 of you if one'll sit in front and nurse a pug. No more." "I will sit in front," said the Nawab Bahadur. "Then hop in, I've no notion who you are." "Hello, what about my dinner? I can't be left alone all the night." Trying to look and feel like a European, the chauffeur interposed aggressively. He still wore a toppy, despite the darkness, and his face, to which the ruling race had contributed little beyond bad teeth, peered out of it pathetically, and seemed to say, "What's it all about? Don't worry me so, you blacks and whites. Here I am, stuck in damn India same as you, and you got to fit me in better than this. She will bring you out some suitable dinner upon a bicycle, said the Nawab Bahadur, who had regained his usual dignity. I shall dispatch him with all possible speed. Meanwhile, repair my car. They sped off, and Mr. Harris, after a reproachful glance, squatted down upon his hams. When English and Indians were both present, he grew self-conscious, because he did not know to whom he belonged. For a little he was vexed by opposite currents in his blood, then they blended, and he belonged to no one but himself. But Miss Derrick was in tearing spirits. She had succeeded in stealing the mud coal car. Her Maharaja would be awfully sick, but she didn't mind, he could sack her if he liked. I don't believe in these people letting you down, she said. If I didn't snatch like the devil, I should be nowhere. He doesn't want the car, silly fool. Surely it's to the credit of his state I should be seen about in it at Chandrapore during my leave. He ought to look at it that way. Anyhow, he's got to look at it that way. My Maharani's different, my Maharani's a dear. That's her fox terrier, poor little devil. I fished them out both with the driver. Imagine taking dogs to a chief's conference. As sensible as taking chiefs, perhaps. She shrieked with laughter. The harmonium's my little mistake, I own. They rather had me over the harmonium. I meant it to stop on the train. Oh law. Ronnie laughed with restraint. He did not approve of English people taking service under the native states, where they obtain a certain amount of influence, but at the expense of the general prestige. The humorous triumphs of a freelance are of no assistance to an administrator, and he told the young lady that she would outdo Indians at their own game if she went on much longer. They always sack me before that happens, and then I get another job. The whole of India seethes with Maharanis and Ranis and begums who clamour for such as me. Really? I had no idea. How could you have any idea, Mr. Heaslop? What should he know about Maharanis, Miss Quested? Nothing. At least I should hope not. I understand those big people are not particularly interesting, said Adela, quietly, disliking the young woman's tone. Her hand touched Ronnie's again in the darkness, and to the animal thrill there was now added a coincidence of opinion. Ah, there you're wrong. They're priceless. I would scarcely call her wrong, broke out the Nawab Bahadur, from his isolation on the front seat, whither they had relegated him. A native state, a Hindu state, the wife of a ruler of a Hindu state. May beyond doubt be a most excellent lady, and let it not be for a moment supposed that I suggest anything against the character of Her Highness the Maharani of Mudcool. But I fear she will be uneducated, I fear she will be superstitious. Indeed, how could she be otherwise? What opportunity of education has such a lady had? Oh, superstition is terrible, terrible. Oh, it is the great defect in our Indian character. And as if to point his criticism, the lights of the civil station appeared on a rise to the right. He grew more and more voluble. Oh, it is the duty of each and every citizen to shake superstition off, and though I have little experience of Hindu states, and none of this particular one, namely Mudcool, the ruler, I fancy, has a salute of but 11 guns, yet I cannot imagine that they have been as successful as British India, where we see reason and orderliness spreading in every direction, like a most health-giving flood. Miss Derrick said golly. Undeterred by the expletive, the old man swept on. His tongue had been loosed and his mind had several points to make. He wanted to endorse Miss Quested's remark that big people are not interesting, because he was bigger himself than many an independent chief. At the same time, he must neither remind nor inform her that he was big, lest she felt she had committed a discourtesy. This was the groundwork of his oration. Worked in with it was his gratitude to Miss Derrick for the lift, his willingness to hold a repulsive dog in his arms, and his general regret for the trouble he had caused the human race during the evening. Also he wanted to be dropped near the city to get hold of his cleaner, and to see what mischief his grandson was up to. As he wove all these anxieties into a single rope, he suspected that his audience felt no interest, and that the city magistrate fondled-eyed the maiden behind the cover of the harmonium, but good breeding compelled him to continue. It was nothing to him if they were bored, because he did not know what boredom is, and it was nothing to him if they were licentious, because God has created all races to be different. The accident was over, and his life, equably useful, distinguished, happy, ran on as before and expressed itself in streams of well-chosen words. When this old geezer left them, Ronnie made no comment, but talked lightly about polo. Turton had taught him that it is sounder not to discuss a man at once, and he reserved what he had to say on the Nawab's character until later in the evening. His hand, which he had removed to say goodbye, touched Adela's again. She caressed it definitely. He responded, and their firm and mutual pressure surely meant something. They looked at each other when they reached the bungalow, for Mrs. Moore was inside it. It was for Miss Quested to speak, and she said nervously, "Ronnie, I should like to take back what I said on the Maidan." He assented, and they became engaged to be married in consequence. Neither had foreseen such a consequence. She had meant to revert to her former condition of important and cultivated uncertainty, but it had passed out of her reach at its appropriate hour. Unlike the green bird or the hairy animal, she was labeled now. She felt humiliated again, for she deprecated labels, and she felt too that there should have been another scene between her lover and herself at this point, something dramatic and lengthy. He was pleased instead of distressed. He was surprised, but he had really nothing to say. What indeed is there to say? To be or not to be married, that was the question, and they had decided it in the affirmative. "Come along and let's tell the mater all this." Opening the perforated zinc door that protected the bungalow from the swarms of winged creatures, the noise woke the mater up. She had been dreaming of the absent children who were so seldom mentioned, Ralph and Stella, and did not at first grasp what was required of her. She too had become used to thoughtful procrastination, and felt alarmed when it came to an end. When the announcement was over, he made a gracious and honest remark. "Look here, both of you, see Indy if you like and as you like. I know I made myself rather ridiculous at Fielding's, but it's different now. I wasn't quite sure of myself. My duties here are evidently finished. I don't want to see India now for my passage back," was Mrs. Moore's thought. She reminded herself of all that a happy marriage means, and of her own happy marriages, one of which had produced Ronnie. Adela's parents had also been happily married, and excellent it was to see the incident repeated by the younger generation. On and on. The number of such unions would certainly increase as education spread and ideals grew loftier, and characters firmer. But she was tired by her visit to Government College, her feet ached, Mr. Fielding had walked too fast and far. The young people had annoyed her in the tum-tum, and given her to suppose they were breaking with each other, and though it was all right now she could not speak as enthusiastically of wedlock or of anything as she should have done. Ronnie was suited, now she must go home and help the others, if they wished. She was past marrying herself. Even unhappily, her function was to help others, her reward to be informed that she was sympathetic. Elderly ladies must not expect more than this. They dined alone. There was much pleasant and affectionate talk about the future. Later on they spoke of passing events, and Ronnie reviewed and recounted the day from his own point of view. It was a different day from the women's, because while they had enjoyed themselves or thought, he had worked. Moharram was approaching, and as usual the Chandrapore Mohammedans were building paper towers of a size too large to pass under the branches of a certain petal tree. One knew what happened next. The tower stuck, a Mohammedan climbed up the petal and cut the branch off, the Hindus protested, there was a religious riot, and heaven knew what, with perhaps the troops sent for. There had been deputations and conciliation committees under the auspices of Turton, and all the normal work of Chandrapore had been hung up. Should the procession take another route, or should the towers be shorter? The Mohammedans offered the former, the Hindus insisted on the latter. The collector had favored the Hindus, until he suspected that they had artificially bent the tree nearer the ground. They said it sagged naturally. Measurements, plans, an official visit to the spot. But Ronnie had not disliked his day, for it proved that the British were necessary to India. There would certainly have been bloodshed without them. His voice grew complacent again. He was here not to be pleasant but to keep the peace, and now that Adela had promised to be his wife, she was sure to understand. "What does our old gentleman of the car think?" she asked, and her negligent tone was exactly what he desired. "Our old gentleman is helpful and sound, as he always is over public affairs. You've seen in him our show Indian." "Have I really?" "I'm afraid so. Incredible, aren't they, even the best of them? They all forget their back collar studs sooner or later. You've had to do with 3 sets of Indians today, the Bhattacharya's, Aziz, and this chap, and it really isn't a coincidence that they've all let you down." "I like Aziz. Aziz is my real friend," Mrs. Moore interposed. "When the animal runs into us the Nawab loses his head, deserts his unfortunate chauffeur, intrudes upon Miss Derrick. No great crimes, but no white man would have done it." "What animal?" "Oh, we had a small accident on the Marabar Road. Adela thinks it was a hyena." "An accident?" she cried. "Nothing, no one hurt. Our excellent host awoke much rattled from his dreams, appeared to think it was our fault, and chanted exactly, exactly." Mrs. Moore shivered. "A ghost." But the idea of a ghost scarcely passed her lips. The young people did not take it up, being occupied with their own outlooks, and deprived of support it perished, or was reabsorbed into the part of the mind that seldom speaks. "Yes, nothing criminal," Ronnie summed up, "but there's the native, and there's one of the reasons why we don't admit him to our clubs, and how a decent girl like Miss Derrick can take service under natives puzzles me. But I must get on with my work. Krishna." Krishna was the peon who should have brought the files from his office. He had not turned up, and a terrific row ensued. Ronnie stormed, shouted, howled, and only the experienced observer could tell that he was not angry, did not much want the files, and only made a row because it was the custom. Servants, quite understanding, ran slowly in circles, carrying hurricane lamps. "Krishna the earth, Krishna the stars," replied. Until the Englishman was appeased by their echoes, fined the absent peon 8 annas, and sat down to his arrears in the next room. "Will you play patience with your future mother-in-law, dear Adela, or does it seem too tame?" "I should like to. I don't feel a bit excited. I'm just glad it's settled up at last, but I'm not conscious of vast changes. We are all 3 the same people still. That's much the best feeling to have." She dealt out the first row of demon. "I suppose so," said the girl thoughtfully. "I feared at Mr. Fielding's that it might be settled the other way, black knave on a red queen." They chatted gently about the game. Presently Adela said, "You heard me tell Aziz and Godbele I wasn't stopping in their country. I didn't mean it, so why did I say it? I feel I haven't been frank enough, attentive enough, or something. It's as if I got everything out of proportion. You have been so very good to me, and I meant to be good when I sailed, but somehow I haven't been. Mrs. Moore, if one isn't absolutely honest, what is the use of existing?" She continued to lay out her cards. The words were obscure, but she understood the uneasiness that produced them. She had experienced it twice herself, during her own engagements, this vague contrition and doubt. All had come right enough afterwards and doubtless would this time. Marriage makes most things right enough. "I wouldn't worry," she said. "It's partly the odd surroundings. You and I keep on attending to trifles instead of what's important. We are what the people here call new." "You mean that my bothers are mixed up with India?" "India's?" She stopped. "What made you call it a ghost?" "Call what a ghost?" "The animal thing that hit us. Didn't you say oh, a ghost, in passing?" "I couldn't have been thinking of what I was saying. It was probably a hyena, as a matter of fact." "Ah, very likely." And they went on with their patience. Down in Chandrapore the Nawab had waited for his car. He sat behind his townhouse, a small unfurnished building which he rarely entered, in the midst of the little court that always improvises itself round Indians of position. As if turbans were the natural product of darkness, a fresh one would occasionally froth to the front, incline itself towards him, and retire. He was preoccupied, his diction was appropriate to a religious subject. 9 years previously, when first he had had a car, he had driven it over a drunken man and killed him, and the man had been waiting for him ever since. The Nawab Bahad was innocent before God and the law, he had paid double the compensation necessary. But it was no use, the man continued to wait in an unspeakable form, close to the scene of his death. None of the English people knew of this. Nor did the chauffeur, it was a racial secret communicable more by blood than speech. He spoke now in horror of the particular circumstances. He had led others into danger, he had risked the lives of 2 innocent and honored guests. He repeated, "If I had been killed, what matter? It must happen sometime, but they who trusted me." The company shuddered and invoked the mercy of God. Only Aziz held aloof, because a personal experience restrained him. Was it not by despising ghosts that he had come to know Mrs. Moore? "You know, Nurdin," he whispered to the grandson, an effeminate youth whom he seldom met, always liked, and invariably forgot, "you know, my dear fellow, we Muslims simply must get rid of these superstitions, or India will never advance. How long must I hear of the savage pig upon the Marabar road?" Nurdin looked down. Aziz continued, "Your grandfather belongs to another generation, and I respect and love the old gentleman, as you know. I say nothing against him, only that it is wrong for us, because we are young. I want you to promise me, Nurdin. Are you listening? Not to believe in evil spirits, and if I die, for my health grows very weak, to bring up my 3 children to disbelieve in them too." Nurdin smiled, and a suitable answer rose to his pretty lips, but before he could make it the car arrived, and his grandfather took him away. The game of patience up in the civil lines went on longer than this. Mrs. Moore continued to murmur. Red 10 on a black knave, Miss quested to assist her, and to intersperse among the intricacies of the play details about the hyena, the engagement, the Maharani of Mudcall, the Bhattacharya's, and the day generally, whose rough desiccated surface acquired as it receded a definite outline, as India itself might, could it be viewed from the moon. Presently the players went to bed, but not before other people had woken up elsewhere. People whose emotions they could not share, and whose existence they ignored. Never tranquil, never perfectly dark, the night wore itself away, distinguished from other nights by 2 or 3 blasts of wind, which seemed to fall perpendicularly out of the sky and to bounce back into it, hard and compact, leaving no freshness behind them. The hot weather was approaching. End of the chapter. Thank you. Thank you.